The door to the Queen's chamber opened before I even raised my hand to knock, and that alone told me something was wrong. Guards do not open doors early, not on the Hive throne, not for a human liaison who ranks somewhere below furniture in the official protocol charts. But there they were, two Veiltharu soldiers taller than any doorway had a right to be, stepping aside to let me in like I was already expected, like I was already late. My name is Ethan Marsh, and 3 years ago I was a xenolinguistics officer with a desk job and a coffee habit. Now I stood in a chamber built from black hive glass, lit by veins of soft blue bioluminescence running through the walls like something alive was breathing just beneath the surface, and I had exactly no idea why I had been summoned without warning. I straightened my collar. It did nothing. My uniform was already soaked through at the back from the walk across the docking spires, because the air on this ring of the station ran hot and thick, built for a species that stored heat in their carapace instead of sweating it out. I had learned to live with the humidity. I had not learned to live with being called in without a reason typed neatly onto a briefing pad first. The Queen Mother, Aelsithra, sat at the far end of the chamber on a throne that was not a throne so much as a living structure, grown rather than built, curling up around her like the room itself wanted to hold her. She was easily 4 meters of dark, segmented elegance, 4 eyes catching the blue light in a way that made her seem to watch every part of the room at once. Veiltharu royalty do not raise their voices, they do not need to. When Aelsithra spoke, the whole station seemed to lean in and listen. "Ethan Marsh," she said, and my name in her mouth came out with a faint clicking undertone, like punctuation made of chitin. "Sit." There was no chair. I had learned this too. When a Veiltharu tells a lesser guest to sit, they mean kneel, and kneeling in front of the Queen Mother is not an insult here, it is simply geometry. I knelt. "Your Highness," I said. "I wasn't told there was a meeting scheduled." "There wasn't one," she said. "I made one, just now, for you." Behind her, half hidden in the shifting blue shadow of the throne's living architecture, something moved. A smaller shape, quicker, restless in the way only the young of any species ever are. Nithka, the Queen's daughter, 16 years old by their calendar, which worked out to something close to 20 in ours, though age meant different things when your species measured lifespans in centuries instead of decades. She did not come forward. She stayed in the shadow, watching me the way she always watched me, which was too closely and for too long, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the heat. I had been avoiding her for 6 weeks, carefully, politely, with reassigned duty shifts and sudden meetings and 100 small excuses that individually meant nothing and together meant everything if anyone was paying close enough attention. Apparently, someone had been. "You look uncomfortable, liaison," the Queen said. It was not a question. "The air recyclers on this ring run warmer than my quarters, Your Highness. I'm still adjusting. You have been on this station for 11 months. Your species adjusts to environment faster than any other coalition member we have hosted. I do not believe the heat is your discomfort." I said nothing. Silence, at least, could not be used against me the way words could. "My daughter tells me you have not shared a meal with her in 6 of your weeks," Aelsithra continued. "That you missed the naming ceremony for the new hatchery, though every other coalition representative attended, that you rerouted through the lower cargo ring twice this month, specifically to avoid a corridor she was known to walk." I felt my stomach drop somewhere near the floor of the station. She had been tracking the pattern, not out of anger, out of the same clinical curiosity she brought to everything. Trade disputes, border skirmishes, the strange new species that had joined her coalition, promising friendship, and then apparently flinching from her only daughter every chance it got. "There were scheduling conflicts, Your Highness," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I heard how thin they sounded. "There were not," she said, without heat, without accusation, simply stating a fact, the way she might note that a star was hot, or that water was wet. "I have reviewed your duty logs." You have created the conflicts yourself, liaison, deliberately, repeatedly, with considerable effort, in fact, given how thin your excuses have become. Behind her, Nithka shifted again, closer to the light now, 4 dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look at literally anything else in the room. I do not understand, the Queen said, and here, for the first time, something in her voice cracked just slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to genuine confusion. A being who had ruled for over 100 years, who had negotiated treaties with a dozen species and crushed rebellions with the same 4 eyes now fixed on me, was telling me she did not understand something. That, more than anything else in the room, told me how serious this had become. I have watched princes of the Ashkarim Empire compete for my daughter's attention with gifts of rare minerals mined from dying stars, she said. I have watched the war sons of the Threll present their battle scars as courtship, each one a story meant to prove worth. I have watched ambassadors twice your species' age offer alliances built entirely around the hope of one day standing where you are standing now, close enough to speak with her directly. And you, Ethan Marsh, a representative of a species that begged for coalition membership only 3 years ago, a species with barely a foothold among the stars, you are the one who runs. I opened my mouth to answer and found that the answer sitting on my tongue, the safe one, the diplomatic one about protocol and propriety, and the delicate optics of a human liaison spending too much time with alien royalty, suddenly tasted like exactly what it was. A lie, not a large one, not a cruel one, but a lie all the same, and I was tired, in that moment, of feeding lies to a queen who had just admitted, in her own strange and careful way, that she was troubled. Your Highness, I said slowly, if I answer you honestly, I need you to understand that my answer is not an insult to your daughter. It is the opposite of an insult, but it may sound strange to you. It may sound like weakness. Something shifted in her posture, not anger, attention, the kind of stillness a predator gives something it has not yet decided whether to respect. I did not summon you here for comfortable answers, liaison, she said. I summoned you here because for the first time in over a century of ruling this station, I have found something I cannot predict, that troubles me more than any war fleet ever has. Nithka took one more step into the light, close enough now that I could see the fine tremor along her lower mandibles. The same tremor she got whenever she was trying very hard not to look like she cared about the answer to a question. So, the Queen said, and for the first time her voice dropped to something almost quiet, almost private, though I knew every guard in the chamber could hear it just as clearly as I could. Why do you avoid my daughter, Ethan Marsh? The blue light pulsed once through the walls, slow and steady, like the station itself was holding its breath along with me. I looked past the Queen, just for a moment, at Nithka, standing half in shadow, waiting for an answer that I had been rehearsing and discarding for 6 straight weeks, and I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that whatever I said next was not going to stay contained in this room. Whatever I said next was going to travel through this station, through this coalition, through every species watching, to see whether humanity belonged among the stars or merely tolerated among them. I took a breath. The recycled air tasted like ozone and something faintly metallic, the way it always did on this ring. Your Highness, I said, may I stand? I would like to answer you properly, and I find it difficult to explain my species while kneeling, like something already defeated. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, the throne's living architecture shifted behind her, folding back just slightly, and I understood it as permission. I rose to my feet. My knees ached from the hard floor. My uniform was still damp against my back, and somewhere behind the Queen, a 16-year-old alien princess who had been quietly, stubbornly seeking me out for 6 weeks, was watching me with 4 dark, patient eyes, waiting to hear a truth her mother had just demanded and that I had spent 6 weeks trying very hard not to say out loud. It is not a short answer, I said. "I did not ask for a short one," the queen replied. "I asked for a true one." And so, standing in a chamber lit by veins of living blue light, in front of a queen who ruled billions and a princess who had somehow, without meaning to, become the reason I rerouted my entire life through cargo corridors and false meetings, I began to speak. I told her first about time. Not station time, not the careful measured cycles the coalition used to synchronize a dozen different species across a dozen different homeworlds. Human time, the strange, brutal, beautiful shortness of it. I told her that where the Veil Tharu measured their lives in centuries, a human measured theirs in decades, and not many of them. I told her that from the moment I was born, some invisible clock had already started counting down, and that every human alive carried that clock with them into every relationship they ever formed, whether they thought about it consciously or not. Aelsithra's 4 eyes did not blink, but something in the angle of her head shifted, the alien equivalent, I had come to learn, of leaning forward. "Your daughter," I said, "will likely live past 300 years. I have perhaps 80, if I am fortunate, if nothing on this dangerous, half-mapped edge of the Coalition's territory kills me first. That is not a complaint, Your Highness. It is simply arithmetic. And arithmetic, I have found, does not care how careful I am with my heart." The chamber was utterly silent now. Even the guards, trained to stand like statues through the driest trade negotiations, seemed to be listening in a different way. "6 weeks ago," I continued, "your daughter began seeking me out. Meals, corridors, the training yards, though she has no reason to walk past the human contingent's drills unless she means to. She is curious about my species in a way that I recognize, because I have seen it before in the very young of my own kind. Not a curiosity that fades, the kind that roots." Nithka, behind her mother, made a small sound, sharp and involuntary, quickly suppressed. I did not look at her. I was not sure I could and still finish what I had started. "And I began avoiding her," I said, "not because I do not value her attention, Your Highness, not because I think less of her for offering it. I avoided her because I understood something that I do not think either of you has yet had reason to consider. In my species, closeness is not a diplomatic tool. It is not currency, the way it seems to function among some of the Coalition's courts. When a human allows themselves to care for someone, truly care, it becomes a commitment that outlives convenience. It becomes grief, eventually, for one side or the other, because someone always is left behind by time." "You believe," the queen said slowly, testing each word like she was weighing it on some internal scale, "that closeness to you would cause my daughter pain." "I believe," I said, "that closeness to me would cause her pain precisely because your people do not yet understand what human closeness costs." You have watched princes bring gifts and warriors bring scars, each one trying to prove they are worth choosing. None of them, Your Highness, are going to die of old age while your daughter still has centuries left to live. I will. Not soon, I hope. But certainly, eventually, and far sooner than anything your daughter has known loss to look like before. I finally allowed myself to look past the queen, to the shadow where Nithka stood, and found her eyes already locked on mine, wide, unblinking, and for the first time since I had met her, entirely still. "I did not avoid your daughter because I do not care for her, Your Highness," I said, turning back to Aelsithra. "I avoided her because I do. Carelessly forming an attachment with someone from a species with a lifespan a fraction of theirs is, in my judgment, a kind of cruelty. I did not want to be the reason your daughter learned what human grief feels like before she had to. I thought distance was the kinder gift. I am beginning to understand, standing here, that I may have been wrong about how that gift would be received." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced on this station before. It was not the silence of an audience waiting for permission to react. It was the silence of a queen who had asked a question expecting fear or ambition or some calculated political maneuvering, and had instead been handed something she had genuinely never had to weigh before. Aelsithra sat motionless on her living throne, 4 eyes fixed on me, and for the first time since I had arrived on the Hive throne 11 months ago, I watched the single most powerful being in this entire quadrant of the coalition fall completely, uncharacteristically silent. The silence stretched long enough that one of the guards near the door shifted his weight, a small scrape of armored plating against the floor, and even that small sound seemed too loud in a room that had gone still around a single unanswered thought. Aelsithra rose from her throne. She did this rarely, I had learned, since the throne itself was grown to serve her, to hold her weight and project her presence without her needing to move at all. But she rose now, all 4 meters of her, and stepped down from the dais with a slow, deliberate grace that made the whole chamber feel smaller. She stopped an arm's length from me, close enough that I could see the fine structure of her carapace, dark as polished stone, threaded here and there with the same faint blue luminescence that ran through the walls, as though her body and her station had grown from the same living source. "You believe restraint is a kindness," she said quietly. "I believe it can be, Your Highness, when the alternative is causing pain to someone who has not yet chosen to accept the risk of it. And who decided," she said, "that my daughter was not permitted to choose that risk herself?" The question landed harder than I expected. I had built my entire 6 weeks of careful avoidance around a single assumption, and standing here, under 4 unblinking eyes and the weight of a queen's undivided attention, I felt that assumption crack for the first time. "I did," I admitted. "I made that choice for her. I told myself it was protection. I am no longer certain that is the whole truth." From the shadow near the throne, Nithka finally moved. She crossed the chamber in a handful of quick strides, faster than her mother, faster than any of the guards who might have stopped her, and came to stand beside the queen, close enough that I could see the tremor in her mandibles was gone now, replaced by something steadier. "You have been avoiding me for 6 weeks, she said, and her voice, still young, still carrying the faint clicking cadence beneath the coalition's translated common tongue, had an edge to it I had not heard from her before. 6 weeks of missed meals and rerouted corridors, and in all that time you never once considered simply telling me why. You decided what I could and could not bear to feel. That is not protection, Ethan Marsh. That is the same thing every warlord and prince who has ever tried to claim me has done. They all decided, on my behalf, what I was capable of choosing. I had not expected the sting of that comparison, and it landed exactly where she meant it to. "You are right," I said, "and I meant it. I am sorry. I did not think of it that way." "Then think of it now," she said. "I am not asking you to promise me centuries you do not have. I am not a hatchling who believes love erases arithmetic. I have read every record my mother's archivists hold on human biology, human lifespans, human grief. I understood the numbers before you ever finished explaining them. What I did not understand until this moment was that you would take the choice away from me before I ever had the chance to make it." Aelsithra said nothing, but her 4 eyes moved between her daughter and me with an attentiveness that felt almost like watching a negotiation unfold between 2 parties she had not expected to see negotiating at all. "There is a difference," Nithka continued, "between a species that offers strength through claws and venom and numbers, and a species that offers restraint because it fears causing harm. My mother's court understands the first kind of strength completely. It is never needed to understand the second kind, because no species we have ever hosted here has shown it to us before. You did not run from me because you thought me weak, or because you thought yourself unworthy. You ran because you thought running was a kindness. I am telling you, plainly, that it was not." I did not have a diplomatic answer to that. I did not think one existed. "Then I will not run again," I said. "Not unless you ask me to." The words came out simpler than anything else I had said all evening, and somehow they felt heavier than all of it combined. Aelsithra studied me for a long moment, then turned to her daughter, and something passed between them that I could not translate. some old and private language of gesture and posture that existed entirely outside the coalition's careful diplomatic protocols. "Leave us, Nithka," the queen said, not unkindly. "I wish to speak with the liaison alone a moment longer." Nithka hesitated, glanced at me once more, something unreadable in her 4 dark eyes, and then withdrew, back into the shadow near the throne, though I noticed she did not leave the chamber entirely. She simply waited, close enough to listen, and neither the queen nor the guards moved to stop her. "You understand," Aelsithra said, once her daughter had stepped back, "that what you have told me tonight will not remain contained within this room." "I assumed as much, Your Highness. Every guard here will carry it to the barracks. Every attendant will carry it to the lower rings. By morning, it will have reached the trade quarter, and by the following cycle, it will have reached every coalition delegation currently docked at this station, human and otherwise. Your species has been a member of this coalition for 3 years, Ethan Marsh. In all that time, you have been measured the way every new species is measured here, by the strength of your fleets, the resilience of your colonies, the usefulness of your technology. Tonight, for the first time, you have been measured by something else entirely, and I confess, I do not yet know what to make of the result." "What result is that, Your Highness?" She was quiet for a moment, her 4 eyes catching the blue light of the chamber walls in a way that made her seem, briefly, almost thoughtful, in a manner I had not seen from her before. "A species that could take what it wants, and instead chooses restraint, not from weakness, but from care," she said. "That is not a concept our strength calculus has ever accounted for. We measure power in claws, in venom, in the size of a fleet, and the loyalty of a hive. We have never had reason to measure the strength it takes to hold power back deliberately, for the sake of someone who has not yet consented to bear its weight. I do not know yet whether that makes your species more trustworthy to this coalition, or simply more difficult to predict. Perhaps, for a queen who has ruled by prediction for over a century, those 2 things are closer to the same thing than I once believed." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and for once, the silence between us did not feel like a failure of diplomacy. It felt like something closer to an understanding, fragile and new, being built one careful word at a time. "Return to your quarters, liaison," she said finally. "I have much to consider, and I suspect the morning will bring questions from every corner of this station that I am not yet prepared to answer." I bowed the way I had been taught, low enough to show respect, not so low as to suggest submission, and turned to leave. At the threshold, I glanced back once. Nithka stood beside her mother's throne, watching me go, and though she said nothing, something in the set of her shoulders had changed since the confrontation began. She no longer looked like someone waiting to be told what she was allowed to feel. She looked like someone who had just won an argument she had been fighting quietly for 6 weeks, and intended to make certain it stayed won. The corridor outside the chamber was empty and cooler than the throne room had been, the recycled air carrying the faint mineral scent that ran through every ring of the station. I walked slowly, replaying the conversation, aware that somewhere behind me, in a chamber lit by living blue light, a queen who had ruled by prediction for over a century was sitting with a single unpredictable fact she had never had to weigh before, and that fact was me. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my narrow human quarters, listening to the low hum of the station's recyclers, and wondered how badly I had miscalculated by assuming silence and distance were the safest gifts I could offer someone who had never asked me to protect her from anything at all. By the time the station's artificial dawn cycle began, brightening the corridors ring by ring in the slow blue-gold light that served every species aboard, I understood that whatever quiet, careful life I had built for myself over the past 11 months was already gone, replaced by something far less predictable and far more alive. The knock on my door came before the first work cycle bell had even finished sounding. I opened it to find Grace Halloway standing in the corridor, arms crossed, her uniform jacket only half fastened, which for Grace meant she had left her own quarters in a hurry. She was the other senior human liaison stationed aboard the Hive Throne, sharp, unflappable, and usually the calmest person on our small human contingent. She did not look calm now. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, before I had even stepped aside to let her in. "Depends which version you heard." "The version where you told the Queen Mother of the Vale Tharu that you have feelings for her daughter, in front of a full guard detail, using the words human grief and lifespan arithmetic." She pushed past me into my quarters and turned to face me, something between disbelief and alarm on her face. "That version, Ethan. Tell me that version isn't true." "That version is essentially true," I said. Grace closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, the way she did whenever a trade negotiation had gone sideways, in a way only she seemed to notice before anyone else did. "Do you understand what you've done? Every species in this coalition measures a new member by exactly one metric: strength, fleets, colonies, tech, resources, leverage. You just handed them an entirely different metric to measure us by, and you did it without clearing it with command, without a briefing, without so much as a heads up to the rest of us." "I didn't plan it, Grace." She asked me a direct question in front of her own court. I could have lied. I decided not to. "You decided not to," Grace repeated, and for a moment I thought she might actually laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Ethan, half the delegations on this station are already talking. The Threll ambassador thinks it's a sign of weakness, that a species too sentimental to seize an obvious advantage when it was handed to them can't be trusted to hold a border. The Ashkarim delegation thinks it's a diplomatic maneuver, some clever human trick to make ourselves look virtuous while we position for something bigger. And the Vale Tharu themselves, from what my contacts in the lower rings are saying, can't agree among themselves whether you just proved humanity is trustworthy or proved we're simply too strange to ever fully understand." "And what do you think?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, studying me the way she studied contract language before signing off on it, looking for the clause that would come back to bite us later. "I think," she said finally, "that you told the truth in a room built entirely around lies of convenience, and now nobody knows what to do with it. That includes command, by the way. I already have 3 messages from Colonel Whitfield asking for a full report before the midday cycle." Colonel Owen Whitfield ran our small contingent with the patience of a man who had spent 30 years in fleet command before being reassigned to the far more delicate work of keeping humanity's newest alliance from collapsing under its own inexperience. He did not send 3 messages before breakfast unless something had genuinely rattled him. "I'll write the report," I said. "You'll do more than that," Grace said. "You'll come with me to the delegation hall in an hour, because half the coalition wants to see the human who apparently invented a new kind of diplomacy overnight, and if you don't show up, they'll assume we're hiding you, which will be worse." She left without waiting for me to argue, and I spent the walk to the delegation hall bracing myself for exactly the kind of scrutiny Grace had described. It was worse than I expected, and stranger than I expected, in almost equal measure. The delegation hall sat at the center of the Hive Throne's diplomatic ring, a vast open chamber ringed with balconies for a dozen different species, each built to accommodate wildly different bodies and wildly different customs, all somehow functioning together under the coalition's careful architecture of compromise. Every balcony I passed seemed to have eyes on me, some literal, some figurative, following my progress across the floor. The Threll ambassador, a broad-scaled being whose entire culture prized open displays of dominance, met my eyes from his balcony with something like contempt. To the Threll, a being that held back power out of concern for someone else's well-being was, by definition, a being that had failed to seize an advantage, and a species that failed to seize advantages could not be trusted to hold territory when it mattered. The Ashkarim delegation, sleek and silver-skinned, regarded me with a different kind of scrutiny entirely, the calculating look of beings who assumed every act, however sentimental it appeared, concealed a deeper strategy. I caught fragments of their translated conversation as I passed, speculation about what humanity truly gained by appearing restrained, what leverage it might be building toward. But it was the Veil Tharu themselves, moving through the lower level of the hall in their ordinary daily business, who surprised me most. A pair of hive attendants paused as I passed, lowering their heads in a gesture I had only ever seen offered to senior Veil Tharu officials, never to a human. Further along, a young soldier, barely out of training by the look of her, watched me with open, unguarded curiosity, the same curiosity I had spent 6 weeks trying to avoid in someone else entirely. I found Colonel Whitfield waiting near the human delegation's modest section of the hall, arms folded, his expression unreadable in the way it always was before he decided whether to be furious or simply concerned. "Walk with me," he said, and led me toward a quieter side corridor away from the crowd. "I've had exactly one night to process what happened in that throne room, Marsh, and I still don't know whether to commend you or ground you. I understand if Command wants a full review, sir." "Command wants a lot of things," he said. "Mostly Command wants to know if you just accidentally started a diplomatic incident or accidentally solved one. Because right now, the reports coming out of the lower rings suggest half this station's population is discussing something they're calling human restraint, as though it's a discovery on par with faster-than-light travel, and the other half thinks we've just revealed a fatal weakness to every predator species in this coalition. With respect, sir, I don't think restraint is a weakness." "I didn't say I thought it was," Whitfield said. "I said half this station thinks so, and until yesterday, I wasn't sure what the other half thought at all. Now I have an answer, and it's not the one I expected." He studied me for a long moment. "You realize the Queen Mother has requested a formal audience with full coalition observers present, 3 days from now." "I hadn't heard that yet, sir." "You're about to. It came through an hour ago. She wants to address the entire coalition on what she is apparently calling a reclassification of humanity's standing within the Alliance. I don't know exactly what that means yet, Marsh, and frankly, neither does anyone else on this station, which is precisely why I have 3 messages waiting for reports from you before midday." I felt the weight of that settle over me slowly. A single conversation, born from 6 weeks of quiet avoidance and one honest answer given under pressure, had somehow grown into something large enough to require a formal coalition audience. "What do you want me to tell you, sir?" I asked. Whitfield studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, the concern giving way to something closer to reluctant respect. "Tell me the truth," he said. "The same truth you gave her. I have a feeling it's the only thing that's going to matter over the next 3 days. Over those 3 days, the station seemed to hum with a kind of energy I had not felt since humanity's induction ceremony 3 years earlier. Delegations that had barely acknowledged our existence before now sought out human liaisons in the corridors, asking careful, probing questions about restraint, about grief, about the strange arithmetic of short lives lived among species who measured their own in centuries. I saw Nithka only once during those 3 days, briefly, across the delegation hall, surrounded by a cluster of younger Veil Tharu attendants who seemed to be peppering her with questions of their own. She caught my eye across the distance and did not look away, and something in her posture, steady now, certain, told me she had spent those same 3 days deciding exactly what she intended to say when the formal audience finally arrived. I did not yet know what that would be, but I understood, standing in a hall full of a dozen species arguing quietly among themselves about the strange new metric humanity had introduced to their ancient calculus of power, that whatever she chose to say, it would matter far more than anything I had already told her mother. The formal audience chamber was larger than any room I had stood in aboard the Hive Throne, built to hold every coalition delegation at once, its high vaulted ceiling threaded with the same living blue light that ran through the Queen's private chamber, though here it pulsed brighter, faster, as though the whole structure sensed the size of the gathering it now held. Every balcony was full. The Threll ambassador stood at the front of his section, arms folded across his scaled chest, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me he had not yet decided how to feel about whatever was coming. The Ashkarim delegation clustered close together, murmuring among themselves in low, calculating tones. Beyond them, delegations from a dozen other species I had only ever seen from a distance during induction ceremonies, all present, all watching, all waiting for the Queen Mother of the Vaeltharu to explain why she had called an audience of this size for what, on paper, appeared to be a minor matter of one human liaison's personal conduct. I stood with Colonel Whitfield and Grace Halloway near the human delegations section, close enough to the center of the floor that I could see every detail of the dais where Aelsithra would soon appear. "Whatever she says," Grace murmured beside me, "you understand this becomes the official record. Every species here will carry it back to their homeworlds. This isn't a private conversation anymore, Ethan." "I know," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that the knowledge did not frighten me the way it might have 3 days earlier. The chamber fell silent as Aelsithra entered, moving with the same slow, deliberate grace I remembered from her private chamber, though here that grace carried the added weight of 100 watching delegations. She climbed to the dais, and beside her, matching her pace with a steadiness I had not seen in her before, walked Nithka. The Queen Mother surveyed the gathered coalition for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried through the chamber with the same effortless authority I remembered, amplified now by whatever ancient acoustics the room had been built to serve. "3 days ago," she began, "I asked a simple question of a human liaison serving aboard my station. I asked him why he avoided my daughter's company when every other species we have hosted here has competed openly for it. I expected an answer built from politics, or fear, or ambition. I received instead an answer built from something I confess my court has never had adequate language to measure." She paused, and the chamber seemed to hold its collective breath, a dozen species leaning forward in whatever manner their bodies allowed. "For as long as this coalition has existed," she continued, "we have measured the worth of a member species by its strength. Fleets, colonies, resources, the willingness to seize advantage when advantage is offered. By that measure, humanity has always ranked among our newest and least proven members, a species that arrived at our doorstep only 3 years ago, still learning the shape of the stars around it." Beside me, I felt Colonel Whitfield go very still, the way he did whenever a negotiation reached the point where the outcome could no longer be predicted from the opening moves. "But 3 days ago," Aelsithra said, "I was shown a different measure of worth entirely. A species that offered an advantage freely, an attachment to my own daughter, a closeness that any court in this coalition would recognize as leverage, chose instead to hold that advantage back, deliberately, out of concern for the well-being of someone it had not yet earned the right to claim. This is not the restraint of weakness. It is the restraint of a species that measures its own strength not by what it can take, but by what it chooses, of its own will, not to." A murmur ran through the balconies, the Threll ambassador's expression shifting from neutral to something more complicated, the Ashkarim delegation exchanging quick, unreadable glances among themselves. "I do not ask this coalition to abandon its old measure of strength," the Queen continued. "Fleets and resources and resilience remain the foundation of every alliance we have built. But I stand before you today to declare that humanity has demonstrated a second measure, one this coalition has never before required of its members, and one I believe strengthens every alliance it touches rather than weakening it. Effective from this audience, humanity's standing within this coalition is reclassified, not merely as a promising new member proving its usefulness, but as a trusted ally whose restraint has been tested and found genuine." The chamber erupted into a dozen overlapping reactions, translated murmurs, and open declarations spilling from balcony to balcony, and through all of it, I felt Grace's hand grip my shoulder briefly, and heard Colonel Whitfield exhale a breath he had clearly been holding since the audience began. Ailsithra raised one clawed hand, and the chamber settled back into silence with the same immediate obedience I had witnessed in her private chamber days earlier. "There is one more matter," she said, "that I believe should not be spoken by me, but by the one who understands it best." She stepped back, and Nithka moved forward to the edge of the dais, 4 dark eyes sweeping the gathered coalition with a steadiness that made her look, in that moment, far older than her 16 years. "3 days ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite its youth, "I listened to a human explain to my mother that he had spent 6 weeks avoiding me because he believed distance was the kinder gift he could offer someone whose life would outlast his own by centuries. I understand why he believed that. I have read the same records my mother's archivists hold. I understand the arithmetic as well as he does." She paused, and something in her posture shifted, resolute in a way that reminded me, briefly, of her mother. "But I did not come here today to speak about arithmetic," she continued. "I came to say that no species, however long its lifespan, however vast its coalition, has the right to decide on my behalf what risks I am permitted to choose for myself. My own mother has ruled by prediction for over a century, and even she was surprised by what this human's honesty revealed. I do not believe restraint should be mistaken for permission to be protected from a choice I am fully capable of making myself." She turned, briefly, to look at me across the chamber floor, and though her voice remained steady, something warmer moved behind her 4 dark eyes. "I do not ask this coalition to understand human grief, or human time, or the strange short arithmetic of a species that measures its lives in decades instead of centuries," she said. "I ask only that this coalition understand that a friendship built honestly, with full knowledge of its cost, chosen freely by both parties, is worth more than any alliance built on leverage or fear. That is the friendship I intend to build, with clear eyes, and full understanding of everything it may eventually cost me." The chamber fell into a different kind of silence then, not the tense, waiting silence of before, but something quieter, more contemplative, a dozen species turning her words over in whatever manner their own cultures processed unfamiliar ideas. Ailsithra stepped forward once more, resting a clawed hand briefly on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture I recognized, even across species, as unmistakably proud. "Let the record show," she said, "that this coalition's understanding of strength has grown today, not through conquest, but through honesty, offered freely, in a room built for lies of convenience. I can think of no better foundation for the alliances still to come." The formal audience dissolved slowly afterward into 100 smaller conversations, delegations breaking into clusters across the hall, some still uncertain what to make of what they had witnessed, others already speculating about what it might mean for their own dealings with humanity going forward. Grace found me near the edge of the human delegations section, arms still crossed, though the tension had gone out of her posture entirely. "Well," she said, "I suppose I owe you an apology for the lecture 3 days ago." "You don't owe me anything, Grace. You were right to be worried. I didn't know how this would land either." "No," she agreed, "but you told the truth anyway. That's more than most people manage, even without a queen and 100 delegations watching." Colonel Whitfield joined us a moment later, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, an expression I had rarely seen from him in 3 years of careful diplomatic work. "I'll want that report by tomorrow, Marsh," he said, "though I suspect it's going to read differently than the one I asked for 3 days ago." "Yes, sir. I imagine it will." Across the emptying hall, Nithka approached, her mother a short distance behind her, speaking quietly with a cluster of coalition officials who had clearly been waiting for the chance to address her directly. Nithka stopped in front of me, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the weight of everything that had happened over the past 3 days settling comfortably between us instead of pressing us apart. "I meant what I said," she told me, "about choosing this for myself. "I heard you," I said. "I won't make that decision for you again." "Good," she said, and something in her expression, steady, certain, entirely her own, told me she intended to hold me to exactly that. "Then perhaps you might finally accept an invitation to share a meal with me. Properly this time. No rerouted corridors." "I'd like that," I said, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I meant it completely. In the weeks that followed, the arrangement between us settled into something neither of us had fully anticipated, an honest, careful friendship built on clear eyes rather than avoidance, bounded not by fear of what time might eventually take, but by mutual understanding of exactly what it would cost, freely chosen by both of us rather than decided in secret by only one. Word of the Queen's reclassification spread quickly through the wider coalition, carried by delegations returning to their homeworlds, and in the months that followed, I heard it repeated in contexts I never expected, a phrase quietly entering the coalition's diplomatic vocabulary wherever restraint needed defending against species who still measured worth only in claws and fleets and easy advantage. It was Nithka herself, months later, standing before a fresh gathering of coalition delegates debating humanity's usefulness as a border ally, who first used my own words back to the wider galaxy, citing them nearly exactly as I had spoken them in her mother's private chamber, a species that measures its strength not by what it can take, but by what it chooses, of its own will, not to. I was not present for that particular speech, but Grace told me about it afterward, grinning in a way I had rarely seen from her. "You do realize," she said, "that a 16-year-old alien princess is out there quoting you to entire star systems." "I hadn't heard," I admitted. "Well," Grace said, "get used to it. I have a feeling this is only the beginning of what that conversation started." She was right, though it would take the wider coalition years to fully understand what had changed that evening in the Queen's private chamber. Humanity had entered this alliance believing it needed to prove its strength through fleets, and resilience and usefulness alone. Instead, standing in a room lit by living blue light, answering a single honest question asked by a queen who ruled by prediction, I had shown an entire coalition of ancient, powerful species something they had never needed before, and would never again be able to unlearn. That the deepest strength a species could offer another was not the power it seized, but the power it chose, deliberately and freely, to hold back for the sake of someone it had not yet earned the right to claim, and that when that choice was finally offered honestly and answered freely in return, it built something far more lasting than any alliance built on leverage ever could.